The Genesis and SNES were coming to the end of their runs. The next generation of consoles was on the horizon, and Atari was leading the charge with their new system, the Jaguar. Launched in '93 in the test markets of New York and San Francisco, Atari attempted to advertise the Jaguar, somewhat inaccurately, as the world's first 64-bit gaming console with the slogan, "Do the math."
Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
It was actually a 32-bit CPU and a 32-bit GPU that I guess adds up to 64 bits.
Some engineer on a whiteboard said, well, I did the addition, we got a 64-bit system. Not really, that was marketing speak. It was 32 bits and barely 32 bits.
The Jaguar was priced at $250 and initially sold well, moving 17,000 units with its debut. The system was boxed with a copy of Cybermorph and a single D-pad, which most critics regard as the worst controller of all time.
You had 3 buttons, and then you could call Grandma on it or dial Miss Cleo because they gave you a whole telephone keypad on this thing. It was kind of a throwback to the Intellivision controller.
The Jaguar was released nationwide in early '94, and initial sales looked good for the system. Game cartridges were ROM-based and held 6 megabytes of memory. However, many of them were just reimaginings of old titles.
Atari was a nostalgic label. I mean, all of us remember the 2600, Atari games in the arcade, but it didn't denote high-end technology, which is what they were kind of trying to sell it on.
Then, in 1995, Atari released the console's only add-on, the Jaguar CD, in an attempt to compete with other disc-based consoles like the PlayStation and Sega Saturn.
They only ever released 15 titles for it, and it was so expensive that it did end up being a bit of a wash.
The CD peripheral only sold about 20,000 units, and many of the titles were ports like Myst and Dragon's Lair. Despite these missteps, the Jaguar would have its relative share of hits. Games like Tempest 2000, which updated the arcade tunnel shooter.
Tempest 2000 was their system seller, and it's polygons in space and shooting stuff. It had pretty graphics for the time, and the sound was okay, and it was an enjoyable game by Jaguar standards.
However, the true shining moment for the system was the first-person shooter Aliens vs. Predator.
This really was the first game that I can remember anyway that allowed you to not only play the game from 3 different perspectives, but it also offered you unique experiences.
The idea that you're going to play all 3 species, human, alien, and predator, goes back to this Atari version. This was not created with the first of the PC games.
However, by 1996, the Jaguar was written off as a loss, selling less than 250,000 units, compared to the PlayStation, which topped 100 million.
So, to put into perspective how hilariously bad the Jaguar sales were, people compare its success to the Sega Saturn, which sold a few million units.
Leftover units were sold off to various companies ranging from arcades.
Atari was able to take some of the hardware and architecture that was created for the Jaguar and sell it off to arcade divisions. Area 51 was actually powered on Jaguar technology.
To the more bizarre.
The unused systems got turned into dental cameras, inflicting more pain upon an unsuspecting populace.
By the late 90s, Atari was purchased by Hasbro, who released the rights for the system. While the Jaguar would find a little life in the modding community, it effectively ended Atari's run as a console maker.
Atari is such a strong brand, something that will so define the late 70s and the early 80s, really showed that, that type of nostalgia hadn't kicked in yet in the early 90s. And as a result, you started to see that Atari brand slip. They don't make consoles anymore. They do make games occasionally, but something that was so prominent in people's minds has really just become sort of a novelty and something that people talk about wistfully and really never go back to play those games again.